Pardon me, chapter 20. Thank you. I'll stand ready. Chapter 20. A new political party was formed, known as the Populist Party. They favored reform. Now, the Populist Party does not exist anymore. It only put up 2 candidates for president in 2 elections in the 1890s, I believe 1892 and 1896. But they were a reform party. Now, one reason I'm so interested in a populist was I grew up in a religious group that probably came from the populist, or is believed by many to have come from the populist. But if you ask any of them today, none of them can tell you what the populist is, probably. But anyway, the populist consisted mostly of the poor people in the country, the dirt farmers, the persons who were having economic hard times and who wanted to see things differently, that things turn out different. Now, one of the things here are the things they advocated. They wanted silver to be money as well as gold. Now, I must elaborate on that. This morning on my way in, I stopped for breakfast and paid for it with a card, a plastic card. Most of you probably know what I'm talking about. Most transactions these days, so a lot of them are done with plastic cards. But before the plastic card came into widespread use, transactions were done with paper money. At one time, paper money had to be backed up with gold at Fort Knox. You know, we were taught when I was in school that this dollar bill would be nothing but paper, except it represented the gold that we had stored away at Fort Knox. Well, Richard M. Nixon, President Nixon, took us off the gold standard. Now, folk, for many years, the price of gold was fixed at $32 an ounce. Today, gold has gone up as high as $90-some an ounce. I don't know what it is right now, but it's much, much higher than $32 an ounce. But when Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard, the minimum wage was about $1.60 an hour. Today, I believe it's up to more than $8 an hour. I don't even know why it changes all the time. Inflation. As soon as he took us off the gold standard, inflation ran rampant. His successor, Ford, had to fight inflation. Carter really had to fight inflation. Finally, Ronald Reagan somewhat brought inflation under control, or made it seem to be. But again, at one time we're on the gold. Now, why is this important for a lesson today? A lot of persons said there was not enough gold, and this was the problem. There wasn't enough gold in the world for everybody to get his fair share. So a lot of persons said, let's use silver as money also. Silver has been called the poor man's gold. The problem was, silver dollars got to be worth 90 cents to a gold dollar. And a lot of mortgage companies felt like they were being cheated if a person would take out a loan, a mortgage on a house using gold standard, and then pay it back using a silver standard. Now, folk, today we know that you cannot have 2 different monetary standards. Nevertheless, at the time, a lot of your poor people said to make silver money also, just like gold is, and put us on the silver standard. But again, the price of silver does not always stay with the price of gold. So we now know this would not have worked, but in those days, they didn't realize that. Now, some of the other reforms they called for, one of them we still have, well, 2 of them. These 2 we still have. These are still on the books. Initiative, referendum, and recall. Initiative means the common, ordinary people can get laws going. Now, the laws still have to be passed by your legislatures and signed by your governor or president. But initiative meant a group of private citizens who get together and make a petition and send this petition to the Congress and get new laws going. Referendum meant that if they didn't like a law, the people could get together, petition the government to strike down laws that the people did not like or get laws taken out of the way they do it, they wouldn't get the Congress or Senate to pass the laws. They'd simply get these laws put on the ballot. In other words, if they wanted a new law, put it on the ballot and see if the people will vote for it or against it. Referendum, question the law that's on the ballot and see if the people voted off the books, off the law books. Now, recall, that had to do with public office holders. If you didn't want to use impeachment, or knew that Congress would not impeach a man, you could put his name on the ballot and see if the people would recall him during election day. In other words, if a man who was in office failed to get enough votes, he'd be removed from office. Now, in my lifetime, I only recall the recall having been used one time. One of the governors of California was removed from office by means of recall. I've forgotten his name. I believe it might have been Schwarzenegger, but I'm not sure. Now, these things, initiative, recall, and referendum that these people fought so hard for 110, 115 years ago, nobody seems to care about today. All right, every time you go vote on the Georgia ballots, there'll be amendments to the Constitution, but as far as ordinary laws, it's all done still with state legislature. The people who work so hard for these just, I mean, we have them on the books, but we don't care about them. Now, this one, direct election of senators. That was done, I believe, 17th Amendment to the Constitution said that senators would no longer be chosen by the vote of a state legislature, but chosen by the common people. I mean, chosen by a vote of the people. Chosen by popular vote. So senators today are chosen by popular vote. Now, this one, very important. We still have this today. Politicians in the old days used to buy votes. And they could get away with it because they could tell which way you were voting, because the voting was done in front of everybody in the open. So a politician might approach you at the ballot box, or if he didn't, his agents would, and say, hey, I'll give you $5 if you'll vote my way. And $5 back then was a lot of money. But a rich politician could pay people to vote his way and basically buy an election. That is more difficult to do because today we have the secret ballot, and politicians cannot be sure which way a person votes once he's gone into a booth and voted. And again, you don't know how he voted. Keep politicians from buying votes. Now, this is still somewhat of an issue. The 1960 election, folk, which occurred when I was but 11 years old, John Kennedy's father is believed to have bought the election or stolen the election for his son, John F. Kennedy. And he did it not by paying people to vote for John F., but by tampering with the ballots, because he controlled some of the mobsters in the District of Chicago where the vote was really close. Nixon could have called for a recount, and the recount might have shown that he won the election. Instead, he didn't, because some Nixon people had done the same thing, and basically there was some cheating going on both sides. But Joseph Kennedy told his son John, I'm not going to buy you a landslide. In other words, I'm going to buy you a close election, but I can't afford a landslide for you. It was still done. Now, of course, the issue of are elections influenced by outside powers, particularly by Russia? That is a very, very hot issue at the moment I'm speaking. And folk, I don't want to say much about it unless one of you want to talk about it. I do not know which way to turn out. But did outside people influence our 2016 election? This is something that's up for grabs still. All right. But anyway, the populists favored these really hard, and most of them eventually were passed. Well, actually all of them were passed except for one, the silver. We do not count silver as money because simply we can't have a double standard. Frances Willard, her book opens up with a big nut. She spoke at the Populist Convention trying to convince people not to drink. This movement was called the Temperance Movement. WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Association. They said that that men who were drunk were more likely to beat their wives or abuse their children than people who didn't. And there's a lot of truth in this. Now, about the time when many of you were really young, preschoolers, an Atlanta Braves manager came home drunk once. His wife scolded him, so he just slapped her across the cheek. Well, she called the police. The police photographed her reddened cheek. And the next day, this manager had to go and face the owner, his boss, and all of his players and all of his team, because the word got around the city like wildfire. So-and-so has slapped his wife, which he actually had done, apparently. He had to undergo counseling for it, but he also did not ever drink that kind of drink again. He would not have done it, folk, had he not been under the influence. It is known that alcohol, I mean, we all sometimes get an urge to just haul off and say something we shouldn't or do something we shouldn't. If we're sober, a lot of times our better judgment will come in and say, no, don't say that, don't do that. When you're drunk, better judgment goes out the window and you're likely to act on what your impulse, act on what you feel like doing. With the result, now, I'll tell you this, you are responsible for what you do while you're under the influence. For those of you who drink, take notice. The law says you're responsible for every action you commit, even if you're under the influence of a drug. So take note, folk. Now, I must say this about the temperance movement. It eventually led to the 18th Amendment being passed, which outlawed drinking. The 18th Amendment only lasted a few years before the 21st Amendment somewhat repealed it and turned it back over to the states. Today, every state allows drinking. We'll talk more about it later, but here's something I want to say about all these reform movements that most people don't realize. You cannot make a change without some unforeseen consequence taking over. Now, some of these days, every one of us will probably get sick unless we get into an accident and die rather quickly. Sometimes the medicines we have to take for our illness do us more harm than the illness itself. There's an old saying, the cure is worse than disease. The same is true in politics. Eventually you stop drinking, make it illegal, so what happens? Bootlegging comes on the rise. And the fact is the bootleggers never pay taxes, so the revenue from this is lost. And people drink who never drank because they say, hey, the law shouldn't be, and they start drinking. The drink that they sell is not governed or regulated, so it can be filthy, full of diseases, full of germs or whatever. Again, no regulation. So the problem is, well, the problem always has been, you try to fix something that's bad, and the first problem comes up. I don't repair my car anymore, folk. After a couple of times really doing some pretty heavy damage to one of my cars, I quit trying to fix them myself. In today's cars, unless you really know what you're doing, you're better off if you hire professional mechanics. You can do more harm, a whole lot of damage really fast by tampering with something you have no business tampering with. And again, unless you are really super trained. Because today's cars are better than yesterday's cars were. But in 1970, they tried to come up with cars that would be easy to work on again. But then technology moved, and to get a car that's easy for an ordinary homeowner, ordinary person to work on is impossible. They're made with too high a technology, too precision made, and you need specialized tools. Again, you try to solve a problem, and that problem you create is worse than the one you solve. Now, the real reason the populace met was a lot of farmers are being foreclosed upon. Now, foreclosure, if you don't know the meaning of that word, maybe you're fortunate. But that's where you take out a loan like for a home. And you can't pay the loan, and the bank comes in and takes your property back. That's called foreclosure. Same thing with a car. You sign to buy a car, and you sign a loan. And you can't make the payment on that loan, so the bank comes in and takes your car. Same deal, foreclosure. I got a bargain of a car one time, an almost new car that had been the bank had foreclosed on. Sometimes it's a good way to get a bargain price. Foreclosed homes. The problem with foreclosed homes and cars both is you never know how much damage the original owner had done to it. But sometimes you get a bargain if you buy foreclosed stuff. Now, my parents taught me and all of our children, don't ever mortgage your house, don't ever mortgage your house. But in today's world, the only chance you have of getting a house is to take out a loan. Well, why can't you say, I had a student ask in the class this morning, why can't you save up enough money? I'll tell you a story. In 1960, if you had started saving for a $20,000 home and saved hard for 20 years, that $20,000 home would have gone up to $50,000. I mean, for real. Or any home you could get, the average price of a home. I mean, a $20,000 home in 1960 was a really, really nice house. The same kind of house by 1980 would have gone up to $50,000 or $60,000. The money you pay on rent, if you're living, assuming you're renting, will keep you from buying a home, or keep you from being able to save for a home. And also, if you'd have started out paying rent in 1960, you might have gotten away with $40 or $50 a month in 1960. By 1980, that rent would have gone up to $200, $300 a month for the same kind of house. In other words, what my parents did not understand, the only way you're ever going to get a house today is to take out a home. And as long as you can make the payments, you can stay. Well, what if you can't make the payments, you lose it? Well, if you were paying rent, they'd just kick you out. You'd still be kicked out. So, again, each of you can decide for yourself what I'm saying. But a lot of farmers at this time were foreclosed upon owing to two things: bad crops, bad winters. They had some bad winters in the late 1800s, and a bad economy. The price of the farmer's product went down and down and down. And I have a brother who tried farming. He had it all figured out. He'd buy cattle at such a price. By the time he sold the cattle, though, the price of those cattle had gone way down. And he lost quite a bit of money on it. Actually lost a lot. But in addition to that, some of his cattle died, which he was not counting on. But the prices went down, and a lot of farmers were foreclosed upon, and this was one of the reasons the Populist Party was formed. Now, Homestead Steel, the management of Homestead engaged in a lockout. A lockout is like a strike, except in a lockout, the management locks the workers out. Management puts a big lock on the door and says, no workers are welcome in here until you agree with me. The strike is where the workers walk off and form picket lines around the factory to keep other workers from coming in. That's a strike. A lockout is where the management locks the workers out and says you won't come in until you agree to my terms and my point. The Homestead strike resulted in a whole lot of people being killed, bloodshed. This Homestead strike was a Homestead lockout, Homestead Steel lockout, which, by the way, occurred around the Pittsburgh area, right about the time my grandfather Cunningham was being born, because he grew up in Pittsburgh. Now, the Pullman strike, that was something else. That occurred in Chicago. Pullman was a railroad tycoon. Now, what I'm about to say was outlawed by President Roosevelt later, but in some cases it still goes on. Company houses. A company house is where when you work for a company, you're required to live in their house and shop at the company store. Pullman set up a place where his workers had to live. It was nice housing. I mean, it was good housing. But once there, he owned you. You had to buy everything, and basically Pullman would pay you. And then you go to his store and buy his products, and he'd get your money back. And you'd pay rent to him. Anyway, the Pullman strike occurred. All right, well, let me back up a little bit. This still goes on, and if all of you are in college. If you go down to Disney World to get a job to help you pay your way through college, and Disney decides to hire you, you will be expected to live in a Disney apartment owned by Disney, and of course you have free transportation all around the park. All you got to do is stand outside and wait for a bus to arrive, and you can get on and go anywhere inside the park. Now, they won't take you outside the park, but you live in Disney property and you shop at Disney stores and we work for Disney. This still goes on. Now, say President Roosevelt outlawed most company houses. my grandfather Cunningham lived in a company house for a while, again until the president outlawed him. It was felt that this gives an employee too much control over the personal lives. I mean, it gives an employer too much control over the personal lives of the employees under him. And I can see why. Well, in the case of Pullman, the economy fell on hard times. His company started losing money. Now, Mr. Pullman himself remained very, very rich throughout all this. And this made the workers angry, but he was not paying he started paying his workers less, but he did not make his rent go down. And he paid his workers less, and he laid off a whole lot of workers, and the rents did not go down. All right, now, oh yes, I must tell you, the way he collect the rent, and the way he collect persons who build up a debt at his stores, he would take the money from you before you got it. So the one man, one worker for him, built up a little bit of debt, and got his paycheck one day, and his paycheck, I believe, was something like 45 cents. Now, this is in a book. How come it was so little? He worked a whole week. Well, Mr. Pullman's bookkeepers took out rent money and took out a lot of the money he'd owed at the store for debt and gave him 45 cents. When he went to the paymaster to collect the pay, the paymaster said, "Do you want this check? 45 cents. He said, "Let Mr. Pullman keep it. I can't do anything." Even at that time, 45 cents was very little. Said if he wants the money, my money that bad, he can have it all. Let him have the rest of it. Anyway, the Pullman workers finally went on strike, but they decided they'd have a peaceful strike. But the strike was crippling the railroads and crippling the whole country because a lot of Mr. Pullman controlled most of the railroads. Finally, President Cleveland said, "We can't allow this," so he sent in federal troops, which is something today's presidents, by the way, would not do. At least I don't believe. The result was a whole lot of bloodshed, particularly when the troops began to engage with the strikers. Strikers and soldiers alike were wounded and killed. A court ordered Eugene Debs, or issued an injunction against Eugene Debs, who was, I mentioned him last time, who was the head of the strikers. Debs refused to obey the injunctions, saying that he had a right and his work had a right to strike. So the courts put him in jail, and he spent several weeks, several months in jail. He came out of jail a socialist. He said, "I went in a Democrat, but I came out a socialist," and he was to run for president 5 times. He would get about 1 million votes each time, or something like 3% of the popular vote every time he ran. He never carried an electoral vote. While these labor problems were going on, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, 2 women, were working to give women the right to vote. Again, eventually they got it. But Susan B. Anthony worked so hard, died just before the 19th Amendment was passed, and never lived long enough to see women's suffrage made the law of the land. All right. Now, the Depression of the 1890s, in some ways, according to your book, was actually the worst depression in all of history. But when we think of depression, we tend to think of the Depression of the 30s. In the Depression of the 30s, no more than about 1/4 of the workers were laid off or were unemployed. In the 1890s, half of the workers were unemployed. What was the difference, folks? Now, again, I've been called opinion. I'm going to issue my opinion here. In the 1890s, the government refused to get involved in helping out and solve the Depression, so the people had to get together and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. In the 1930s, the government promised it would end the Depression, and the Depression started in 1929, went on and on. 1930, 1931, 1932, 1933, 1934, 1935, 1936. In 1937, it got worse still. In 1939, it got really bad. Then in 1940, it ended rather fast. World War II had broken out in Europe. The United States started helping the Allies, and all of a sudden people woke up one day and found out all the factories in town were begging for workers and even trying to steal each other's workers. the Depression was over. World War II ended the Depression, but it wasn't because Roosevelt wanted it ended. We'll talk more about that later. But now, in the case of the Depression of the 1890s, a man went to Washington to try to convince the government to hire workers to fix things that needed fixing. Jacob Coxey, and he was right about this. He said there's a lot of roads that need to be built, and the ones that we have need to be repaired. Well, yes, that was true. He said there's a lot of bridges that are really dilapidated that need to be repaired before they collapse. Well, that was true. A lot of government buildings, they're getting old and need to be either remodeled or torn down and rebuilt. Very true. So he said, I'm going to try to persuade our president to do this. Well, the issue, where's a president going to get the money? Oh, borrow it. Easy solution. He suggested that the government write bonds, issue bonds, that would not bear interest. Now, folks, give you some idea. U.S. government savings bonds do not pay a lot in the way of interest. But supposing, now, a guy in 1960 had bought a $50 government bond. If it bore no interest, today this bond would be worth $50. $50 is not worth at all what $50 would in. But if I'd have bought a bond that bore any kind of interest at all, like 1%, that bond today would be worth $500 or $600. So I could get my computer out and calculate it. It'd be worth a lot more money. But anyway, Coxey wanted the government to issue non-interest bearing bonds. Now, I have to elaborate on this a little bit because when the next big depression occurred, the Depression of the 30s, John Maynard Keynes said that when depression hits the country, the government should spend like crazy to get us out of depression. And how would the government get its money? Again, by going into debt. But here's the good news. Once the depression is over, according to Keynes, the government can pay back the debt. Here's what happened. In the Depression of the 30s, the government borrowed money. The Depression never ended. War broke out. The government went deeper into debt. The war ended. There was no depression, and the government kept going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. This is not what John Maynard Keynes promised us, by the way. But, nevertheless, the idea sounded great. Now, to his credit, now a lot of persons, including your book, will criticize Grover Cleveland, what he did. Grover Cleveland refused to do what Jacob Coxey. Now, Jacob Coxey got together a group that is called Coxey's Army. Now, he was not the last person to march on Washington. Later, there were other marches on Washington to try to collect money from the government or try to resolve it. Even Martin Luther King led a march on Washington. And another man recently tried to get a 1,000,000-man march. Some of you might remember, but he could not get 1,000,000 men together to march on Washington. Martin Luther King led a march on Washington to get the... When Martin Luther King actually got the Civil Rights Act passed. But in the case of Coxey, he went all the way to the White House yard. He was accused of trespassing and jailed. He was not given anything he asked for. The people who followed him, he picked up more and more people as he marched. Coxey's Army, they called it. He picked up people. Eventually, the army became disillusioned, discouraged, and went home. But Jacob Coxey, maybe he had the right idea. Grover Cleveland did not think so. Which takes us up to the election of 1896. Generally, the losing party has its convention first. Well, in 1892, the Democrats had won. The Republicans met first, and they nominated William McKinley. We had two candidates, both of them named William McKinley. Now, the Democrats met. Now, this was before you had the primary. Oh, yes, the primary came later. Of all these reforms, initiative, recall, referendum, secret ballot, there was no primary yet. So the convention chose a candidate. Well, things were hot that day, and the delegates got tired. In the midst of the convention, a young man spoke up named William Jennings Bryan. And he made a really emotional speech, a fiery